Hello and welcome to Tigers by the Fire, a podcast out of Holy Cross High School about World War II discussions and stories. This is Season 6, Episode 4, and today we're going to be talking about Auschwitz-Birkenau. This is an extremely serious topic, obviously. One of our members on this podcast team, Frankie, attended a trip to Auschwitz with us last Thanksgiving. So this is the year anniversary kind of that, and it really spurred a lot of interest in this topic for him. But this podcast is going to cover a number of different things, including the prelude up to it, and then some stories, just some accounts from Auschwitz. So with me today are Paxton.
Hi.
Frankie.
Hello.
And Matthew.
Hello.
And so without further ado, I'm going to turn it over, I guess, to Frankie, who's going to talk a little bit about the Wannsee Conference, which took place at the Wannsee House, a place that Frankie visited last year.
Yeah, so one thing I wanted to start off with, and why I wanted to start it off with the Wannsee Conference, is I wanted to make it realized and make it apparent that this didn't just happen overnight. The Wannsee Conference was the beginning of all this. It started the Final Solution, and if you go to the house like I did, you wouldn't think much of it. It kind of just looks like a house on a street. You walk in, and it definitely feels uneasy. But the Wannsee Conference was the catalyst of all these events. It's what started the mass killing, which took over just 1 million lives alone in Auschwitz itself. Which was supposed to be just a dinner at first, turned into being what I said, where they planned millions of people's deaths. The people that consisted of it were SS General Reinhard Heydrich, who was there, the chief of Reich Security in the main office, and several other high-ranking Nazi officials who sat at a dinner table, which was supposed to just be a dinner, but turned into being this horrible, horrible event. Now, from there, you get the Final Solution. You get all these different objectives that the Nazis created and how they were going to get rid of and exterminate the Jewish and other populations in Europe. So what turned out to be what was supposed to be a dinner, or what looked like the dinner, was really just complete and utter evil. Now, I think I don't want to go too long on the Wannsee Conference here, because the main part of this podcast, as previously said, is Auschwitz. And one thing we wanted to really focus on with Auschwitz is the inner workings of it. So with that being said, I think Paxton has something to say on it.
Yeah, so a big misconception with Auschwitz was it was just a place for the death of the Jewish people. But this wasn't the case. There was actually 3 main camps that made up this big camp, and they were 3 subsects. The first camp was just Auschwitz, and it was actually not made to be a killing center for the Jews, but it was made as a smaller concentration camp for Polish prisoners in 1940. And then, after the Wannsee Conference, they sort of branched out and made Auschwitz-Birkenau, which was the second camp where most of the killings, gas chambers, crematoriums, and everything else was. And then after, they made Auschwitz III, or Monowitz, which was the sort of work camp, which had a bunch of different factories. I think one of the main ones was a rubber factory where they just took these Jews that they took from their homes and sort of just placed them in this camp, and the just living conditions were awful. They were put in sheds with just their beds were just sheets of plywood, and they would shove maybe 5 to 6 people to sleep in a night, and it wasn't insulated at all. It was just a shack in the middle of frozen Poland.
And,
so
Frankie, I know you've been to some of the barracks. How would you, and I think Paxton did a great job describing it. Frankie, how would you describe walking through them 80 years later, obviously?
I mean, yeah, that's what I was about to start talking about, but it's very surreal almost. You walk in, you feel the heavy presence. You can see how, you can't even imagine how they fit all these people in these different rows, because the bunks aren't big, and they were fitting, like Paxton said, all these people and stuffing them together like sardines in a can, in a non-insulated room filled with a few hundred people, I'm pretty sure. Mm-hmm. And just in these awful conditions. As soon as you walked in the room, and we actually went to a children's barrack.
Yeah.
So it just kind of added this extra tone to it. This, not only were these adults that were going through this, but innocent children as well, having to go and live under these horrid conditions. And one thing that I noticed when we were going in there, the children made, and the parents of, I guess, of the children, they made the best out of their situations. It's a horrible thing to say, but they had drawings on the wall. Like you could see like where they tried to like make themselves almost at home and try to protect these children and their like identity. But here's another thing off of this. The Auschwitz camps actually so before they were sent there, many were described as undesirable, and also to not return was one of the labels they were given. They were to be executed. They were given a certain amount of time until they were either killed. So these people that were trying to make the best out of them, many of them were already predetermined their death.
And so one thing I kind of want to add on to that is that the people that were like sort of, as Frankie described, like predetermined to die, it was either they were immediately offloaded from the train after a week of not eating and just sitting on this train moving. They were unloaded at Auschwitz-Birkenau and they were sorted to either go straight to the gas chamber. And people like this, they were elderly, children, or like sick, or mothers like with their kids that didn't want to like abandon them. They were just immediately put into the gas chamber, which could hold around 2,000 people at one time. And as soon as they were loaded in, usually the lights turned off and they were poured, or the Nazi officers poured Zyklon B and other pesticides on the people. And like it usually took around 10 to 20 minutes of just suffocating before everyone was just laying on the ground dead. And there was these sort of special Jewish prisoners who would actually had the job of unloading the people from like these dead bodies from the gas chambers and bringing them to the crematorium, which is kind of just messed up. And the ashes of those people were used as fertilizer or just dumped in nearby rivers.
Yeah, I've always found that, and you guys have heard me say this in class, like the more you research this stuff, the worse it actually gets. And so I've always found the job of the special prisoners to be exceedingly like excruciating. Like they have to clean up every day, right? These dead bodies, and they're getting fillings out of their teeth. They're doing all sorts of things attached with it. But then just the pure disposal of the people who were getting slaughtered, it must have been, just a horrific task to do day in and day out. And like Paxton said, the idea of the gas chambers and using this, and Frankie kind of hinted at this before. Like, I think one of the most important things Frankie said at the beginning is that this is not a process that instantly happens overnight. It is thought out. And so before they build gas chambers at Auschwitz-Birkenau, right, they've tested all of this out, right? They've come up with what they believe is the quickest, most efficient way to kill as many people as possible and then dispose of them. And I'm going to turn to Frankie again, because you got to walk into one of those gas chambers a year ago. What was it like for you?
So in many ways, it's similar to the barracks because you can feel like something went on here, but it's also so crazy to look at this because one of the things you see is how mechanized it is. In the area itself where they would gas these people and they would kill them and then murder them, there would be this little track that would run inside of it. And on that track, they would put the bodies on, store it on, roll it out, and then right next door in the same building was some crematoriums. So they were they were just like getting really more efficient with it, I should say. They were so efficient in their ability to mechanize death. Now, like, you could walk in and I have pictures, I have all these memories that I had got from this, and it is so surreal to see what they did to these people and how they were able to do it. But another thing I wanted to say, the man who's primarily in charge of all this, Rudolf Hess, he was the head commandant at Auschwitz. It was in charge of most of these executions and the operations of the camp. In one of his statements from the Nuremberg trials, it is eerie because essentially they're asking him, did you do this? Did you do this? Did you do this? Did you kill all these Jewish people? And without a second word, he just responds every single time, yes, 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 yes. He doesn't even try to deny it. Because he knows, a person who's very sick and cruel and sadistic, that there is no denying this. What he did happened, and there's lots of evidence, no matter how much they tried to destroy when trying to leave. But another thing I wanted to mention about him is how almost accustomed the German people were to this. Rudolf Hess's family actually lived outside of the gates of Auschwitz I, and many other officials and people lived around this. This was in not a secluded area. When we went, there's houses nearby. So there's no way people didn't know about this, but it was just the fact that the Nazis were so able to convince everybody and so just destructive in their ability to suppress people that they were able to get away with this, that nobody even batted an eye, it seemed. And it wasn't that people also internationally didn't know about this. Other countries knew about this. They knew about where Auschwitz was. They just couldn't do anything about it.
So one thing I want to bring up is like how, or just touching on like the previous point of how thought out this was. As soon as they were sorted and they were chosen to go to the labor camp, they were first, like they stopped at Auschwitz I, which was sort of like the administration camp, and they were given a number, and that number was tattooed on their arm, and they kept like meticulous records of how, like, what they did, where they were going, if they didn't really keep records of the people that were immediately like just murdered, but the people who made it to Monowitz, they were just like given the striped pajamas and just, or let me see, there were different colors and just denotations, I guess you could say, of like what the prisoner was like meant to do. And
yeah, you're talking about on the actual uniform.
Yeah,
the color differentiations. I know you guys had a chart kind of in your outline for that.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's different groups of people get different symbols, different workers have different symbols, kind of it goes down from there. And so, yeah, and I think that's something that a lot of people forget. Like, this isn't just going to be Jews as well. Like, there's going to be Roma, there's going to be homosexuals, there's going to be Slavs, other groups of people. And then, of course, they do sort them for labor, and they're going to be using a lot of them as slave labor in this process. Frankie.
Yeah, so adding on to your point there, we have a little statistic on here of estimated deaths because, again, like I said, with Rudolf Hess, when I was talking about him, they destroyed a lot of these records. So a lot of the information that we're getting right now, we don't know if it's complete. There could be all these missing records that they destroyed of all these atrocities that they did. But from what we do know, there's about 960,000 Jewish people died there, along with 74,000 non-Jewish. And that included groups such as Coach Arvadi said, the Roma, the Soviet POWs, and other nationalities such as Polish POWs as well. All these people were systematically murdered by the Nazis in the way that I described with the gas chamber and other methods as well. A good example of one of these deaths, and as you know, we're a Catholic school, is St. Maximilian Kolbe.
I was actually just about to say, I hope you mentioned St. Maximilian Kolbe. Yeah, talk about a horrific story, and you got to go to the place where he actually died.
Exactly, yeah. That was one of the most impactful places to me. I'm not saying any place was more than the other, but
it was all impactful.
Yeah, but like for me as a Catholic, like seeing somebody, a part of my faith, who is a saint, go through that and die. So his story, if you're not familiar with it, St. Maximilian Kolbe was a priest who was sent to Auschwitz after basically speaking up against and disagreeing with the Nazis.
Yeah.
And when he went, these group of people escaped. And the punishment for when people escaped, they would take a select group of people and send them in starvation chambers.
Yeah.
One of the people that were selected this time when the person escaped cried and was begging. He said, my family, what is my family going to do without me? St. Maximilian Kolbe heard him. St. Maximilian Kolbe ended up stepping up and taking the place of that man. He would end up dying in the starvation chambers during Auschwitz. But he's a perfect example of like not only the Catholic faith in our Holy Cross mission, what we have here of giving up selfishly for others, but it's a bright spot in this horrible situation. Kind of like how I mentioned the parents and the children were painting on the barracks of Auschwitz II. It's the light and the dark that you kind of see through this, like the human nature that comes out in the darkest times, and you see the goodness in people.
Yeah, they actually just released a movie, I guess it was in September, I think it's called Triumph of the Heart, about Maximilian Kolbe. And his story is pretty horrifying. Like, I mean, he volunteers to take the place of these prisoners, as Frankie said, and then he's put into this very tiny isolation cell where they starve him to death. They just literally just don't feed him until he wastes away and dies. And they would do this to people all the time. We walked down in that room, and how many cells it was like 20 something cells.
Yeah.
And those were starvation cells, isolation starvation cells. And so it's really an incredible story. And sometimes you do see that, right? in the midst of all this hatred and horror, you do see these kind of stories that show you that there's still decent people in the world. And he obviously was willing to sacrifice himself to save people he didn't even really know. Like, I mean, he knew them because they're all prisoners, but it wasn't like, from all accounts, it wasn't like anyone he was like overly close to or friends or grew up with. It's just people he wanted to do the right thing. And in a story where not enough people do the right thing, it's always interesting to hear, even though it was a very tragic end.
Exactly. But one of the things I also want to point out is from our trip to Auschwitz itself is when we got to go to Auschwitz and we got to visit all of this and see all of these things. One of the things that we saw, and I can still remember it, it's something, the only room where you can't take a picture. It's a jar of ashes that they've collected from the crematorium. It just puts you into perspective of like what these people did. You don't know who's in there. You don't know how many bodies are in this jar, but you know, like, that was a person or people. And it is the most sacred room that I think you can go through, because it's just a perfect example of what these people had to go through and what they had to endure through their time in Auschwitz.
Right. And I wanted to go into personal accounts because I think it's important to mention. And one of the things is a book called Night, and it's by Elie Wiesel, and I recommend it for like viewers who don't know about it. It's a great start to first read of learning about Auschwitz. And
What grade did you guys read it in for school?
Ninth grade.
Yeah.
Ninth grade, yeah. And that, would you say, Matthew, that book had a kind of a big impact on you understanding this topic or learning about it for the first time?
Especially, and I think it was also kind of a slow way of bringing up people who don't know anything about it into slowly learning about it in a way. Now, it's an autobiographical account of his experience during the Holocaust. And at the start, I want to go back to when Frankie mentioned Maximilian Kolbe, how he was strong in his faith and he continued through Auschwitz. Sorry. At the start, Elie is still deeply religious, but when the Nazis invaded his faith, humanity, and his will to live, all these things are tested in unimaginable ways. I mean, throughout these horrors, many people struggle to stay in faith. So not only are they dehumanized, but they also lose the very faith they try to keep. And upon arrival, I just want to say men and women are divided into separate parts, and the prisoners are sent either to work or to the gas chambers if they're deemed not able to do any labor. And the prisoners endured starvation, beatings, roll calls in freezing weather, and constant fear of death. The list goes on.
Yeah.
And like you mentioned before, we read this in ninth grade, and I believe Frankie and Paxton has some opinions about how it impacted them.
Yeah, there was a lot of just messed up stuff in that book. There was one, like, after the camp was liberated, him and his dad had to march, or not even march, run. Like, I think it was around 10 miles after they were starved and just beaten all the time. It was just sad to see at the end of that, like, his dad, who was with him the whole time, at his time at Auschwitz, died of dysentery. And like, he literally had him in his arms and was trying to stop him from drinking water to like stop poisoning himself. And it was just really sad to like just read that as like a freshman in high school.
Yeah, another thing on those death marches that Paxton was talking about, the death marches itself were a horrific event, and a part of this horrific event of Auschwitz and the Holocaust itself. The death marches consisted of about 56 to 60,000 people and resulted in about 15,000 people dying or so. These people died from all sort of reasons, whether they were sick, they were just left on the side of the road, shot if they stopped walking, or trampled, or just died from disease, all these different things that they had to go through, such as Ellie's dad, who passed away from dysentery. Mm-hmm. They had to go through this after already being starved, beaten, and tortured through the camps. Now they had to run through the freezing cold weather to what they thought was another camp, while the Nazis are shooting them and starving them still. So that just puts you in perspective of how awful of a condition these people were in.
Yeah, and the thing about that book that I think it does a really good job of is you learn about the Holocaust in school, and you hear, oh, this is 6 million Jews, this is 9 million people, 10 million, 11 million people, right? but the book gives you a face, right? And you get to see an interview with him after, I know, as part of the class, but also it gives you that actual story. And that's one of the things that whenever we've talked about it in my classes, and you guys have all had me now forever, we always look at the cards, right? We look at those ID cards from the Holocaust, and it just kind of puts a name with it, because it's not 6 million Jews, is it? Right? It's people. It's individual people, individual families that are crushed by this. And I know, Krell, you're going to talk a little bit about the Hungary, right?
Right. And that was my second account, was by a woman who lived in Hungary. And for context, Germany invaded in Hungary in 1944. And the very first task the German government gave to the Hungarians was to round up all the Jewish families so they can be deported to Auschwitz. And I mean, to picture this, 500,000 Hungarian Jews were sent in under just 6 weeks in a total of 147 cattle cars. I mean, they were all just stuffed in there. There was no room.
Yeah.
And the cattle cars were like just the start of all this terror that we'll see later on. But yeah, she remembered the night of packing all these things. I mean, she put in like clothing and other necessities that she might need. And later on, her mother actually came back into the room and she started to unpack the said things out of her bag. And her mother actually ended up filling it with just food that she had cooked, warm clothing, and bedding. And that was what they left with. And they would actually take a lot of their family jewels and other jewelry to maybe be traded for other future food as means for survival. I believe Frankie has something to add on to this.
Well, not really to add on, but I wanted to add a second sub point, I should say. So one of the things we got to see through night is the condition they were under. So Elliot and his father were in Auschwitz 3, and that was run by IG Farben, the pharmacy company.
Yep.
And it was the production side of it. Now each camp, there's 3 camps, as we might have said before. Auschwitz 1, the main camp; Auschwitz 2, Birkenau, the death camp; and Auschwitz 3, Monowitz. One I said was run by IG Farben. One of the things that we got to see through there is the food that they were given. It was like a sawdust bread and just disgusting soup that you wouldn't even probably give to dogs. So they were given like animal food. They were treated worse than most dogs, and they were in these horrible conditions. But they were so starved that they were eating this because they needed to. There's a story of when Auschwitz was in a raid, or I should say Monowitz is in a raid, air raid, and instead of seeking cover and hiding, which they were doing, one of the people tried to go out and grab food from the middle where there was all this food, and instead of the soldiers hiding and protecting themselves or fighting, they're worried about these guys getting food and they shoot them. That just puts you in perspective of like, they weren't concerned about the war really there. They're concerned about this liquidation, this execution of all these Jewish and other minorities that were in Europe. They were worried about that race, the Aryan race that they were been propagandized by Hitler for over years.
So, like, some more background to that story is that they wouldn't allow the Jewish prisoners to actually hide. There would be these watchtowers with Nazi soldiers, and they would make the Jews like sort of just stand in place and not allow them to even just try and hide in the barracks. Even though the barracks wouldn't really do anything, they just forced the Jews to stand there and just wait until the air raid was over, and then they could move. And the prisoner that did end up moving, he had his head just shoved into like this cauldron of just sort of watery soup, and then the Nazi officers shot him in the back of the head, just to give some more background to that story.
I believe just to show how much the SS officers had a lack of empathy and just how brutal they were. One of the other accounts I had was where this man would walk one day and he saw a few tomatoes growing outside, and he was starved so much and he was just tempted to grab it. And when he went to grab it, the officers caught him and he was beaten so brutally, and he still actually has scars to this day. And when he was taken to the hospital, there was a certain rule that he mentioned that if you didn't heal in 4 to 5 days, they actually take you to Birkenau and you would be gassed essentially. And Frankie has something to touch up on.
Yeah, so a little point to add on to the sadistic and cruel nature of these prison guards is that they actually had to take an empathy test. Whoa. Go back to when I said prison guards.
You good?
An empathy test where they were given this test where they were told, they were basically seeing how well they would react to and how much empathy they would be given. That just shows like they wanted the most cruel people to be there.
And just to like show how like ruthless these guards were, there was cases of Jewish prisoners throwing themselves into the electrical fence like surrounding Auschwitz just to get away from them and just try and end their suffering.
Right. And now for discretion advised, we're about to talk about some twisted experiments that have taken place. There's this guy named Dr. Mendel, and he was obsessed with twins, and some of these children who are now elderly have little memory of the experiments, and others have memories that may not be 100% accurate. Now, some of these accounts mentioned that Mendel has removed organs from people without anesthesia, and if one of the twins died, the other one would be murdered, as well as the first experiments that these people was subject to involved being kept in a small wooden cage, and actually her sister was being given painful injections in her back. She doesn't know why, but they believe it was an attempt to change the color of her eyes. And I believe a lot of these twin cases was obsessed with just eyes for no reason.
Yeah, so I just wanted to add a little point before you go back to Dr. Mengele was one of the head officials also there that ran it. He ran the experiments department and the research department of it. Mm-hmm. He was a scientist. Now, here's the thing about him. This man wasn't dumb. He was a doctor. Granted, it was in a pseudoscience, but he was still a doctor. He graduated from college. That's a good thing to remember about a bunch of these people, these officials. They weren't dumb. They were college educated. They were smart, but they believed in these horrible, horrible, horrible ideas. It just shows you like really this could be any country. Any country's one step away from this if you really think about it. Like if well-educated people in Germany, which prior to this have had one of the highest education rates in the world, they're able to go through this and they're able to go through this rapid transformation. What's stopping America? What's stopping England? What's stopping all these other countries? So I just wanted to point that out. He's a perfect example of like how quickly everything can change. Mm-hmm. All right, back to you, Crow.
Right. And I mean, all of his experiments are just twisted, and like you said, he's highly educated. But I mean, for like another experiment, this woman says that there was like a pair of them and more than 100 other twins were given lethal injections of bacteria that would cause a disease. And I want to go back, and I believe Paxton mentioned it earlier about the death march. And as the Soviet army was approaching Auschwitz, the Nazis decided to evacuate the camps to prevent the prisoners from being liberated. Now, these prisoners weren't given any food, almost no rest, and they had to walk through the snow and freezing temperatures. So what makes it so terrible is that if any of the prisoners would to fall or go too far behind, they would be immediately shot, and they would just continue the march. And I believe Frankie has something to add on to about the liberation.
Yes, the liberation of Auschwitz itself was conducted by the Soviet Red Army in the year 1945 on January 27th. The army is recorded when they walked in, seeing people lying against the fences. They're emaciated, and this goes from the majority of all death camps and labor camps that have been found, included by Americans and other forces. They describe these people to be skeletons almost. We actually went to the National World War II Museum not too long ago, where we saw accounts of liberations from both prisoners and soldiers. Even the soldiers, just remembering what they saw, brought to tears. Mind you, these are soldiers that have fought for years, killing people, having to survive themselves. They've seen atrocities that some of us can't even imagine. But just the sight of these people, they're brought to tears, and still to this day, that just shows you how horrible this situation was. They walked in, they saw one of their accounts was they saw 7,000 frightened and exhausted prisoners in the barracks. Now, that is horrible to just think about that. And going along back what Crail was talking about, Paxton and me were talking about this death march. These people were brought on this march, but the people that couldn't be brought, they were liquidated. They were shot in their beds, some of them. Like, the camp went through a mass liquidation when they found out the Soviet army was coming. And also, another point about this, prior to the evacuation, they were planning on expanding this. They're planning on expanding the whole camp itself. They knew the war. A lot of officials knew the war was already over, and they could see it happening. But they were still getting ready for the mass extermination. They thought it was still a go.
Yeah, I think when and you guys have hit up on a bunch of things. When we had Mengele, we talked about liberation. Oh, this is just not even a scratch of the surface, right? It's just a skim off of everything that could be done. And obviously a 35-minute podcast, you can't cover all that stuff. But you guys have had an interesting experience, I guess, for high school kids, because you're in a class that covers the Holocaust to a great extent. The first basically half of the semester was mostly dedicated to that. So what I wanted to ask you guys, I mean, you chose this topic, obviously, and Frankie visited these areas, but for Matthew and Paxton, how did you feel when you were, some maybe rereading some of Night, but researching some of the actual events that you just kind of talked about, Paxton?
Well, I mean, I don't want to sound like rude, but I find it interesting on how like these people thought, because it's just kind of like so like crazy on how they just believed this thing, and they actually believed it about like how Jewish people were just their problem, or like the reason for their problems. And I just wanted to like kind of see the reason behind why you would want to do this. It doesn't make any sense for just anyone to go to this extent to assign a number for a person. And like, yeah.
And just want to say I was horrified by the events that had taken place, but I'm in a similar situation where I was interested, because Frankie mentioned earlier, these people aren't dumb. They were educated. And I mean, some of them had friends that had the Jewish faith, and they just threw them aside like they were nobodies.
Yeah, and at the beginning, Frankie brings up the Wannsee conference, right, where they're planning out the final solution. And you look at the list of the people who are on that, and all of these guys have doctorates, or they're lawyers, or they're all college educated. Like the SS, there's aptitude tests to get in. And so it's this highly educated society. And the question you guys are asking, which is like, how could this happen? That was the question at the Nuremberg trials, right? In 1946, 47, 48, is they're trying to figure out, well, how do we go from discrimination, which happens in a lot of countries. The U.S. is by no means a country that didn't have discrimination in the 40s and 50s. Or historically, right? But the idea of having death camps, of taking people's hair out, right, for fabrics, like these things were unheard of at the time. Frankie.
Yeah, so a good point there about the U.S. at the time, and going back to the Wannsee Conference and many things that were brought up there. They used a lot of our laws having to do with segregation and other things on the Jewish people, such as like keeping them completely separate from them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow laws inspired a lot of the Nuremberg laws.
Another thing I wanted to just talk about is media today. I think Auschwitz itself takes the high and president and like front view of the Holocaust.
Yeah.
When you think of the Holocaust, you think of the gates or the train station at Auschwitz-Birkenau.
Absolutely.
And I think it's well represented in media today, such as through a movie we just watched in our class, Schindler's List.
Yep.
You see Auschwitz. Now, in the movie, the director takes a little liberty and he goes on. He creates the scene because it never happened. They never went to Auschwitz, but he felt it was important.
And that's how important it was in the public conscience, to your point, Frankie, is that Spielberg puts that scene in the movie to emphasize the Holocaust and everything else, because he knows that most people just associate Auschwitz with the event. And to Frankie's point, like there's 1 million people who are shot in the Holocaust before Auschwitz even opens. And so these are things that are before the big gas chambers open. So these are things I think that are really important to understand. This is just one part of this horrific story that encompasses millions upon millions of people.
Yeah, I think in the movie, there's a great scene. So we were talking about the people that were forced to deal with these dead bodies and all the crematoriums and how to process the cremations of their fellow Jewish people. In the movie, you see a scene where all the Jewish people's belongings are getting brought into this one area, and there's other Jewish people having to sort them and having to take the jewels out of stuff and the fillings of the teeth. You see this, and I think it's a great form of media that you see today of how Auschwitz is in the Holocaust itself, in the process of it, is represented. Another thing that is probably like a most obvious form of representation today is the camp itself and being able to go to tours there.
Yeah, it's very well preserved. Most of the other ones are destroyed. Matthew, you're going to send us off.
Oh, I was just going to add on more about the movie because, I mean, what really spoken out to me was the part of the movie they showed was actually they didn't want to like leave a trace of this culture because one point they had to build a road and it was just filled with the tombstones of people who were Jewish. And I just wanted to add on to that because that kind of spoke out to me.
Yeah, and another thing that I got to see on this trip is how much of Jewish history was destroyed. You can see it, like, we go through a cemetery and synagogues that were standing there for hundreds of years. Yeah. And they're destroyed. Their tombstones are shattered. Their graves are defiled. You can see it. You can see the scar that's left on the Jewish population in Europe. And you can look at it in numbers too. The significant number drop in all these different countries from like having in Poland dropping around 99%.
Yeah, 99%.
So this mass extermination, you can still see it today. And
the Jewish population is so diminished and it doesn't ever really recover, obviously, because they're mostly killed. And so, man, talk about just a very heavy topic and something that I know you guys could talk more about. And we may have an option to do that in the second season that we do in the second semester. But I just wanted to give you guys a chance to close it out. Just general thoughts, and then we'll have an exit. So I'll have Paxton lead us off. Just anything. What did you get from the experience of researching?
I mean, the main thing I got was just sort of like the atrocities that happened. Like, I don't believe, like, some of the stuff, it just doesn't seem real. Like, it would actually happen. And like, that's just like what I read from all of the main thing. Actually, the like main thing I saw, not from just researching Auschwitz, but just like the final solution, was how quickly people would just turn on to hating the Jewish people. Because there was an article I was reading, it was, I think, Estonia or like Latvia, one of the Russian like satellite states, how quickly they just invited the Nazis in after they were sort of like taken over, and they would just find Jewish people in the street and just beat them, which was just kind of shocking.
Yeah, and there are a bunch of incidents where they get the local populace to do some of the murders for them, which is, again, it's kind of surprising how quickly some of that turns. Matthew, what are your thoughts?
I mean, when I previously started researching it, I didn't really know that much about Dr. Miguel.
Yeah, Mengele.
Yes, sorry for correcting. Thank you for correcting me. But I mean, I knew he was done all these horrendous experiments, but I mean, just to actually like read everything about them and his obsession with twins, it was just kind of taking me back, and also like kind of made me realize the points we made, how educated some of these people were to do these things.
And then to do that to children, like, it's just the scope of it is kind of disgusting. So, Frankie.
Yeah, I mean, ever since that trip, like Coach have already said, I've been pretty interested in this topic and how they were able to systematically erase a generation of people, essentially, and a whole group and culture from Europe, and how people just jumped on board. And getting to do some more research on this for this project really opened my eyes up into how even more sadistic than I thought it was. Like, one of the accounts that we saw, it's a sadistic joke that they brought in. When they would transport the Cyclone B into the camps, it was using the Red Cross.
Yeah,
they use the logos on their trucks. So like, it was just really, it opened my eyes to how horrible of an event this was and how sadistic these people were.
Absolutely. Well, guys, excellent job. And for the listeners, man, I hope you got something out of it. This is Tigers by the Fire. Thank you for listening. We'll see you later.